Hey guys, tonight we're going to embark on a journey, not through distant galaxies or ancient pyramids, but into a world that, in many ways, feels just as alien to us now, the Soviet Union. Imagine stepping out of your cozy, well-lit room, past the perfectly stocked fridge, and into a bleak, gray apartment block where the paint peels and the scent of stale cabbage often lingers. Picture yourself joining a queue that snakes around a corner, not for the latest iPhone, but for something as basic as a loaf of bread, hoping it doesn't run out before you get to the front. You're shivering, not from the AC, but from the bone-chilling cold that seeps through ill-fitting windows. This isn't a theme park ride. This is what life was like, and you probably won't survive this mental shift without feeling a distinct chill. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always wild to think about us all experiencing this together, across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on cobblestones, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth. It's 1917, and the world around you is fracturing. The old order, the Tsarist Empire, is crumbling like a sandcastle hit by a rogue wave. You hear distant shouts, the clatter of horse hooves, and a strange, almost electric hum of change in the air. This isn't a gradual shift, it's a seismic upheaval. The Bolsheviks, led by a stern-faced man named Lenin, are seizing power, promising peace, land, and bread. Sounds good, right? Like a delicious warm loaf fresh from the oven, if only it were that simple. But for you, the ordinary person, these grand pronouncements translate into immediate, often bewildering changes. Overnight, your landlord isn't your landlord anymore. Your apartment might now be shared with complete strangers thanks to housing nationalization. Suddenly, private property is a quaint, old-fashioned concept, like trying to use a rotary phone in the age of smartphones. You're told this is for the greater good, for equality, but it mostly feels like chaos. You watch as factories, once privately owned, are declared state property. This is a mainstream historical fact, the nationalization of industry, and it meant that suddenly the concept of a boss working for profit disappeared, replaced by a nebulous the state. Imagine showing up to work and your entire management structure has been swapped out for committee members who seem just as confused as you are. The economy, already in shambles from World War I, spirals further. Money, the very thing you use to buy a warm coat, starts losing its value faster than a snowball in summer. You might get paid in soznaki, paper notes that are little more than glorified IOUs, constantly devaluing. It's like trying to pay your bills with monopoly money. Only the stakes are very real. You hear whispers of war communism, an emergency policy where the state takes everything, grain, goods, even your spare boots, to support the Red Army in the ongoing civil war. Farmers, who just wanted to grow their food in peace, are especially hit hard. They hide grain, bury potatoes, anything to keep a little something for themselves and their families, leading to tragic famines. This period, with its harsh requisitioning, led to widespread peasant revolts. Historians still argue whether war communism was a pragmatic necessity to win the Civil War, or a dogmatic attempt to immediately implement socialist principles, regardless of the human cost. It felt, to you, more like a prolonged hunger pang than a grand experiment. And then there's the quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle if you weren't so desperately cold and hungry, the sabbatniks. These were voluntary, unpaid workdays, usually on Saturdays, where people were encouraged to contribute extra labor for the good of the revolution. Think of it as forced volunteering, but with extra layers of ideological zeal. You'd show up, perhaps to clear rubble or chop wood, alongside your neighbors, all trying to look enthusiastic while silently wishing you were anywhere else, preferably somewhere with a hot meal. It was supposed to be a demonstration of revolutionary fervor, but for many, it was just another obligation in an already exhausting existence. You might even hear jokes whispered, very quietly, about how a sabbatnik was just a clever way to get free labor, like inviting your friends over to help you move, and then subtly disappearing when the heavy lifting starts. Life, you quickly learn, is about adaptation. You learn to barter for goods, to make do with what little is available, and to keep your thoughts to yourself. The promise of a utopian future feels very far away when you're just trying to find enough firewood to stay warm. The revolution, which promised liberation, initially felt like a heavier set of chains, albeit different ones. The old world was gone, devoured by the fires of change, and the new one was being built on foundations of scarcity and uncertainty, one cold, hungry day at a time.
The dust of the Civil War slowly settles, replaced by a new, more insidious kind of quiet. You might have hoped for a return to some semblance of normalcy, a chance to breathe, but instead, you feel a tightening, a slow, inexorable squeeze. Lenin, the architect of the revolution, passes from the scene, and a power struggle begins to brew, casting a long, dark shadow over your life. Suddenly, the promises of peace, land, and bread start to feel like distant echoes, replaced by a new, more ominous slogan. Stalin is the Lenin of today. And indeed, Joseph Stalin begins to consolidate his power, pulling the reins of the party tighter and tighter. You witness his rise, not as a sudden coup, but as a gradual, almost imperceptible shift. One day, a local party official you knew well is gone, replaced by someone new, someone whose loyalty to Stalin is unquestionable. The newspapers, always a source of official truth and often unofficial confusion, begin to feature Stalin's face more and more prominently, his stern gaze seemingly following you from every public poster. It's like watching a slow-motion takeover of your entire reality. This era is marked by a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and fear. You learn to speak in hushed tones, especially when discussing anything remotely political. A casual remark at the market about the quality of the bread could be twisted into counter-revolutionary sentiment. Your neighbors, once sources of camaraderie and shared hardship, now eye each other with a new wariness. The infamous NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, becomes a name whispered with dread. They are everywhere and nowhere, a shadowy presence that can arrive at any hour, for any reason, or no reason at all. It's like living under a perpetual invisible spotlight, always wondering if your every move, every word is being scrutinized. A mainstream historical fact of this period is the purging of political opponents. Stalin systematically eliminated rivals, both real and perceived, from the party and state apparatus. These weren't just backroom maneuvers. They often involved public show trials, where prominent figures would confess to absurd crimes, their faces gaunt, their voices monotone. You might listen to these broadcasts on the radio, sitting in your cramped apartment, a shiver running down your spine. It was a macabre theater, designed to instill terror and absolute obedience. Historians still argue whether the scale of the purges was primarily driven by Stalin's personal paranoia or a calculated strategy to eliminate all potential opposition to his totalitarian rule. Either way, for you, it meant a constant, gnawing anxiety. And then, there's a quirky tidbit. The cult of personality around Stalin grew to almost surreal proportions. He wasn't just a leader. He was depicted as a benevolent father figure, a genius, a titan of thought and action. Statues of him sprung up everywhere. His portrait adorned every wall, and poems and songs were composed in his honor. It was like living in a world where everyone was required to admire the same celebrity, but this celebrity held absolute power over your life. You might attend public rallies where cheers for Stalin were deafening, a forced display of collective enthusiasm. You'd raise your hand, clap, cheer, even if inside you felt only a chilling emptiness. It was a strange, almost theatrical performance of loyalty, and you were a reluctant actor in it. Imagine if every advertisement, every news report, every piece of art in your life was solely dedicated to praising one person. That was your daily reality. The state also began to exert control over every aspect of life. Education, arts, even family structures were reshaped to fit the Soviet ideal. You're taught that the collective is paramount, that individual desires are secondary to the needs of the state. Your children are enrolled in organizations like the Young Pioneers, where they are indoctrinated with communist ideology from a tender age, learning songs about Lenin and marches about the glories of socialism. It's like every institution, every facet of your existence is being meticulously re-engineered to produce the new Soviet man or new Soviet woman. This means you're constantly reminded of your duty, your role in the grand socialist experiment. The weight of this expectation can feel crushing, like trying to carry a building on your shoulders. You learn to smile when you're supposed to smile, nod when you're supposed to nod, and always watch what you say. It's a subtle, pervasive form of control, like an invisible hand guiding your every move, making sure you stay on the approved path.
With Stalin firmly in command, your life takes an even more dramatic turn, especially if you live outside the burgeoning cities. The grand vision, as proclaimed by the party, now demands that the Soviet Union leap from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse, and the fuel for this monumental transformation is, you guessed it, the peasants. This brings us to the harsh reality of collectivization. Suddenly, your small plot of land, perhaps tilled by your family for generations, isn't yours anymore. The decree comes down, unwavering and absolute. All individual farms must merge into kolkhozes, collective farms. It's like being told your entire family business, built up with sweat and tears, is now being absorbed into a giant state-run corporation. You're no longer working for yourself, you're working for the collective, and, by extension, for the state. The idea is to modernize agriculture, increase efficiency, and free up labor for the new factories. On paper, it sounds logical, like streamlining production. In reality, for you, it feels like everything you know and hold dear is being ripped away. The resistance, if you dare to call it that, is met with brutal force. You hear stories, hushed and terrifying, of peasants who refuse to give up their land or their livestock. They are labeled kulaks, a derogatory term for supposedly rich peasants, even if they're just slightly better off than their neighbors. Being deemed a kulak is a death sentence, or at best, a one-way ticket to a forced labor camp in the freezing north. Imagine being told that owning a couple of extra cows makes you an enemy of the people. It's absurd, yet terrifyingly real. This is a mainstream historical fact. The dekulakization campaign led to the persecution, execution, or exile of millions of peasants. It was a class war waged against the very people who fed the nation. You watch as your cherished cow, perhaps your family's sole source of milk and a vital asset, is taken for the collective. Some peasants, in a desperate act of defiance, slaughter their animals rather than hand them over to the state. This, of course, creates even greater food shortages. It's a tragic, self-destructive cycle. You learn quickly that overt resistance is futile. Compliance, however bitter, is the only path to survival. Historians still argue whether the scale of the collectivization famine, particularly the Holodomor in Ukraine, was a direct result of deliberate policy to break peasant resistance or an unintended consequence of poorly planned and brutally implemented agricultural reforms. For those living through it, the distinction was irrelevant. The hunger was very real. A particularly quirky tidbit from this time was the desperate ingenuity of the peasants. Faced with impossible quotas and the requisitioning of their grain, they'd hide food in the most improbable places, buried under floorboards, secreted away in ovens, even in hollowed-out tree trunks. It was a constant game of cat and mouse with the state requisitioning brigades, who, armed with their quotas, would search every nook and cranny. You might spend hours carefully concealing a handful of potatoes, knowing that a single discovery could mean starvation for your family. It's like a grim, high-stakes hide-and-seek where the prize is your next meal. The promise of mechanization, of gleaming new tractors, making your work easier, often feels like a cruel joke. Yes, some tractors arrive, but they break down frequently, and spare parts are scarce. The collective farms are often disorganized, managed by party loyalists with little agricultural expertise. You're working longer hours, often with less reward, and the food you produce is primarily taken by the state, leaving you with meager rations, if any. The initial years of collectivization lead to a drastic drop in agricultural output, contributing to widespread famines, the very thing it was supposed to prevent. You might see children with swollen bellies, a horrifying sight that becomes tragically common in certain regions. Your identity shifts. You are no longer merely a peasant, a farmer. You are a kolkosnik, a member of the collective, part of a vast, centrally planned system. Your life, from your daily labor to your access to food, is now dictated by directives from Moscow. The individual, the family, the local community, these traditional bonds are strained, sometimes shattered, under the relentless pressure of the state. It's a profound reordering of society, a massive social experiment conducted on a scale never before seen, and you are living its most brutal consequences, trying to survive on the dwindling crumbs left behind.
While the countryside groaned under the weight of collectivization, a different, equally monumental transformation was underway in the cities. You, if you were lucky enough to escape the brutal realities of rural life, or were simply born in an urban center, would witness the relentless drive for industrialization. The party's new mantra was to catch up with and surpass the capitalist West, and that meant building factories, mines, and infrastructure at a breakneck pace. It was a race against time, fueled by unyielding will and immense human effort. You see the results of this push everywhere. New factories, sometimes built from scratch in what were previously empty fields, begin to dominate the landscape. Giant blast furnaces glow against the night sky, their orange light a testament to human endeavor. The air quality, you quickly notice, declines dramatically, often thick with the smell of coal dust and industrial fumes. This is the era of the 5-year plans, ambitious economic targets set by the state dictating exactly how much steel, coal, and electricity must be produced. It's a mainstream historical fact, these plans, and they become the central organizing principle of your economic life. Every worker, every enterprise is measured against these almost impossible goals. It's like being part of a giant national production line, where everyone is expected to hit their quota, no matter the personal cost. Millions migrate from the villages, fleeing the famines and hardships of collectivization, drawn by the promise of work and a steady wage in the industrial centers. Cities like Magnitogorsk, built from nothing into a steel-producing giant, spring up almost overnight. You might find yourself living in a hastily constructed barrack or a communal apartment, sharing a single room with multiple families. But at least there's work. This rapid urbanization leads to immense overcrowding and strain on public services. Lines for everything, from the public bathhouse to the cafeteria, grow longer. It's a chaotic, vibrant, often exhausting existence, filled with the clang of machinery and the constant churn of new arrivals. Despite the hardships, there's a strange kind of collective optimism, at least on the surface. Propaganda posters declare the triumph of socialism and show muscular workers forging a brighter future. There's a pervasive sense that you are part of something grand, something truly historical. You're told you are building a new world, a worker's paradise, and if you just work hard enough, endure the present sacrifices, utopia is just around the corner. It's a powerful narrative, especially when reinforced by parades, rallies, and constant media saturation. Imagine if every single movie, song, and billboard you encountered was solely dedicated to convincing you that your current suffering was temporary and leading to ultimate glory. A quirky tidbit from this industrial push is the phenomenon of shock workers, or udarniki, and Stakhanovites. These were individuals who supposedly dramatically exceeded their production quotas, becoming national heroes. The most famous was Alexei Stakhanov, a coal miner who, in 1935, supposedly mined 102 tons of coal in a single shift, 14 times his quota. Whether his achievement was real or meticulously staged by propaganda, it didn't matter.
You were constantly exhorted to emulate these heroes, to push yourself beyond your limits for the good of the state. It was like a national reality show, where the contestants were judged on their output, and the prize was not fame and fortune, but public recognition and perhaps a slightly better ration card. Historians still argue whether the Stakhanovite movement truly boosted productivity or primarily served as a propaganda tool to extract more effort from the workforce through moral coercion. Life in the factory is harsh. Long hours, dangerous conditions, and low wages are the norm. Safety standards are often ignored in the race to meet quotas. You might see accidents, hear stories of injuries, but questioning the pace of work is simply not an option. Yet for many, especially those who came from the impoverished countryside, the factory offered a stability they had never known. There was a roof over their heads, however leaky, and a consistent if meager wage. You might even feel a sense of pride as you watch the steel pour from the furnace or a new locomotive roll off the assembly line, knowing you contributed to its creation. It was a brutal bargain, but for a nation desperate for progress, it was the one being offered. The hum of machinery and the shouts of foremen became the new soundtrack to your existence, echoing the relentless rhythm of a nation transforming itself at immense human cost.
As the industrial gears grind forward and the collective farms solidify, a chilling new chapter unfolds, one that touches almost every family and instills a deep, pervasive dread. This is the era of the Great Purge, a period of intense political repression and terror that makes the earlier forms of control seem almost benign by comparison. You don't just hear about it, you feel its cold breath on your neck. The official narrative, endlessly repeated in newspapers and on the radio, speaks of rooting out enemies of the people, saboteurs and traitors, who are secretly undermining the Soviet state. But the definition of an enemy becomes terrifyingly broad. It could be anyone, a factory manager, a party official, a scientist, a writer, even your next-door neighbor. The fear is that the revolution, like Saturn, is devouring its own children. This is a mainstream historical fact, the Great Purge, and its scale was staggering. Millions were arrested, interrogated, sent to labor camps, or executed. The numbers are so vast they almost lose their meaning. But for you, it's about the empty chair at the dinner table, the sudden disappearance of a friend, the hushed whispers of your parents. You learn to be incredibly careful with your words, even within the supposed safety of your own home. A careless joke, a forgotten relative who once owned property, an association with someone who later fell out of favor, any of these could be enough to trigger suspicion. Children are even encouraged to report on their parents, a horrifying inversion of family loyalty. Imagine living in a world where your own child might be incentivized to turn you in for a perceived ideological transgression. It's a level of psychological warfare that corrodes the very fabric of trust. The show trials become a macabre spectacle, broadcast for all to hear. Former high-ranking Bolsheviks, many of whom helped build the Soviet state, stand accused of incredible conspiracies, plotting with foreign powers, sabotaging industry, assassinating leaders. They confess, often after weeks or months of torture and psychological torment. You listen, perhaps trying to reconcile the image of the revolutionary hero with the pathetic figure confessing to outlandish crimes. Do you believe it? Do you dare not to believe it? Historians still argue whether the confessions extracted during the Great Purge show trials were solely the result of torture and coercion, or if some individuals genuinely believed they were making a final sacrifice for the party. For you, the listener, the message is clear: no one is safe. A particularly quirky and chilling tidbit from this period is the phenomenon of unpersoning. Once someone was arrested and condemned, their images would be removed from photographs, their names erased from books and documents, as if they had never existed. It was historical revisionism on mass scale, an attempt to literally wipe individuals from the collective memory. You might look at an old group photo, notice a blank space where someone once stood, and understand, without a word being spoken, that they had been purged. It's like living in a constantly updated, terrifying version of Photoshop, where people disappear, and you're forbidden to ask why. The terror penetrates every layer of society. The party, the military, the intelligentsia, all are decimated.
Many of the most talented and experienced individuals are removed, leaving a void that will have profound consequences for the nation, especially as the shadow of war looms. You might attend meetings where people denounce each other not out of genuine conviction, but out of a desperate need to demonstrate their own loyalty and deflect suspicion. It's a grotesque dance of survival, where the music is the constant hum of fear. You learn to keep your head down, to work hard, to be outwardly enthusiastic about the latest party slogans, and above all, to never, ever question. The fear is palpable, a heavy weight in the air that makes breathing a little harder, speaking a little softer. It's not the visible violence of the revolution that defines this period, but the chilling, unseen hand of repression, reaching into every home, touching every life, turning neighbor against neighbor and friend against friend. The grand socialist experiment is marching forward, but it's fueled by an engine of fear, humming a terrifying lullaby that lulls everyone into silent, anxious compliance.
Just as the shadow of the purges begins to recede, replaced by a tense, fragile calm, a far greater storm gathers on the horizon. The whispers of war, initially distant rumblings from Europe, grow louder until they become an undeniable roar that shatters the fragile peace. This is the period of World War II, or as it's known here, the Great Patriotic War. And for you, it transforms everything you thought you knew about hardship. On June 22, 1941, the invasion begins. German tanks roll across the border, and the Luftwaffe fills the sky with the terrifying drone of bombers. It's a shock, despite the growing international tensions. You hear the news, perhaps over a crackling radio, and a cold dread settles in your stomach. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Nazi invasion, Operation Barbarossa, caught the Soviet Union largely by surprise, despite warnings, and its initial onslaught was devastating. The efficiency of the German war machine is terrifying, pushing deep into Soviet territory with astonishing speed. Life immediately shifts to a war footing. Men, and later women, are mobilized into the Red Army. Factories, which were just beginning to churn out consumer goods, now switch entirely to producing tanks, planes, and ammunition. You might find yourself working even longer shifts, under even more grueling conditions, often with insufficient food. The collective farms, already struggling, are now tasked with feeding not just the cities, but a massive army. Imagine working 14-hour days in a dimly lit factory, knowing that every rivet you secure, every piece of metal you forge could be the difference between victory and defeat on the front lines. The scale of the conflict is unimaginable. Cities are besieged, none more famously than Leningrad, which endures a horrific 900-day blockade. You hear stories of its inhabitants freezing and starving, surviving on scraps of bread made from sawdust, or even consuming shoe leather. It's a testament to human endurance, but also a stark reminder of the war's brutality. Entire towns are obliterated, and millions of soldiers and civilians perish. The human cost is almost incomprehensible, far exceeding that of any other nation involved. Historians still argue whether Stalin's pre-war purges of military officers significantly hampered the Red Army's initial response to the invasion, exacerbating the early losses. A particularly quirky tidbit from this period involves the Night Witches. These were daring female pilots, part of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, who flew flimsy biplanes made of wood and canvas on daring night missions, harassing German positions. They turned off their engines and glided silently over targets, dropping bombs, earning their fearsome nickname from the Germans. Imagine the sheer courage of these women, flying barely more than kites into the dark against a technologically superior enemy. Their bravery and the bravery of countless others becomes a beacon in the pervasive darkness. Everyday life is defined by scarcity and sacrifice. Food rations are meager, and you learn to be inventive with what little you have.
Ersatz coffee, made from roasted acorns, becomes a common sight. You might queue for hours for a piece of bread, your breath fogging in the frigid air. The sound of air raid sirens becomes a frequent, heart-stopping interruption to your nights. You huddle in basements, listening to the distant thud of bombs, hoping your apartment block won't be next. Losing a loved one to the front lines or to starvation becomes a tragically common experience, a shared grief that binds communities together. Yet amidst the immense suffering, there's also an incredible surge of patriotism and collective determination. You are fighting for your homeland, for your survival against an existential threat. The propaganda shifts from abstract ideology to a visceral defense of Mother Russia. Stories of heroism, both on the front and in the factories, become rallying cries. You participate in the war effort however you can, knowing that every scrap of energy, every ounce of resilience is needed. The war is not just a conflict, it's a crucible that forges a new, hardened identity for the Soviet people, one born of unimaginable sacrifice, and ultimately a hard-won, devastating victory. The sounds of battle echo in your memory long after the last shot is fired, a constant reminder of the price paid for survival.
The guns fall silent, but the echoes of the war and its devastating consequences linger long after. You emerge from the conflict into a landscape scarred not only by bombs and battles, but by the immense human toll. This is the period of post-war reconstruction, a monumental undertaking to rebuild a shattered nation, and you are part of its immense, exhausting effort. The victory, though hard-won and celebrated with an outpouring of relief and pride, comes at an almost unimaginable cost. 27 million Soviet citizens are dead, soldiers and civilians alike, a staggering number that touches virtually every family. Entire cities like Stalingrad and Kyiv lie in ruins. Factories are destroyed, farmlands are scorched, and infrastructure is decimated. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses of any nation in World War II, both in terms of human life and material destruction. The scale of the damage means that immediate relief is scant. Instead, you are faced with an even deeper level of privation. Rationing continues, and food remains scarce. You might find yourself still queuing for hours for the most basic necessities. The memories of wartime hunger still fresh in your mind. The official line is one of triumph and resilience, but your daily reality is one of grinding hardship. People live in makeshift dwellings, share cramped communal apartments, and contend with a severe shortage of consumer goods. Imagine trying to start a new life when everything around you is rubble, and even a simple pair of shoes is a luxury. The rebuilding effort is immense. You, along with millions of others, are mobilized for the task. Factories are painstakingly reassembled, often using equipment salvaged from the wreckage. Women, who had stepped into crucial industrial roles during the war, continue to work in heavy industry and construction, their labor vital to the recovery. The spirit of collective effort, forged in the fires of war, is now directed towards national recovery. It's like everyone is part of a massive, involuntary construction crew, working tirelessly to put the pieces of the country back together. A particularly quirky tidbit from this time is the trophy brigades. As the Red Army advanced into Germany, they systematically seized and transported vast amounts of industrial equipment, scientific apparatus, art, and even entire factories back to the Soviet Union. This was seen as a form of reparations and a way to jumpstart the devastated Soviet industry. You might hear whispers of entire trainloads of machinery arriving from the former enemy territory. While officially framed as just compensation, it also provided a quick, if ethically questionable, boost to the rebuilding process. Historians still argue whether the scale of these trophy acquisitions significantly aided Soviet recovery or primarily served as a means of retribution and a source of advanced technology.
Despite the collective effort, the government's priorities remain firmly focused on heavy industry and military might, rather than immediate improvements in living standards for the ordinary citizen. Your personal sacrifices are still expected for the greater good of the state. While monuments to victory are erected and parades celebrate the heroic effort, your own stomach might still be rumbling. The initial post-war years are a continuation of austerity, a grim testament to the long shadow cast by the conflict. The propaganda machine, however, quickly pivots from wartime heroism to the glory of peaceful labor. You see posters depicting strong, smiling workers rebuilding the motherland, children playing in newly constructed parks, and lush harvests from the collective farms. It's a stark contrast to the often grimy, exhausting reality. You learn to live with this dichotomy, the grand vision presented by the state versus the persistent scarcity of your daily existence. The lingering effects of the war, the physical scars on the land, and the emotional scars on the people are everywhere, a constant, unspoken reminder of the immense price paid for survival, and the endless work still ahead to reclaim any sense of normalcy.
Just as the physical rubble of war is being cleared, a new kind of chill begins to descend, not from the harsh Soviet winter, but from the geopolitical climate. The world, freshly divided by the battle lines of World War II, quickly segments into two opposing blocks, and you find yourself living on the eastern side of a newly drawn ideological frontier. This is the dawn of the Cold War, and its icy grip subtly yet profoundly reshapes your daily life, even if you never hear a single shot fired. The former wartime allies, the Soviet Union and the Western powers, particularly the United States, quickly become adversaries. The rhetoric emanating from Moscow, endlessly broadcast on the radio and printed in the newspapers, portrays the West as a decadent, aggressive force, hell-bent on destroying the socialist paradise you are supposedly building. You are constantly reminded of the need for vigilance, for unity, against this external threat. It's like being told every day that your neighbors across the street are secretly plotting against you, even if you rarely see them. This is a mainstream historical fact. The ideological and geopolitical confrontation between the US and the USSR defined the latter half of the 20th century. The Cold War manifests in your life through an intensified focus on military spending and national security. Resources that could have gone into consumer goods or improving housing are instead funneled into building a massive army, developing nuclear weapons, and funding proxy conflicts around the globe. You might not see the ICBMs, but you certainly feel the pinch of continued scarcity. The promise of a better life just over the horizon is perpetually deferred due to the necessity of defending the socialist homeland. Travel abroad becomes almost impossible, restricted to a privileged few deemed absolutely loyal and essential. The Iron Curtain, a term famously coined by Winston Churchill, becomes a very real barrier in your life, limiting your access to information, goods, and people from the outside world. Foreign radio broadcasts are often jammed, their signals distorted into static, and Western newspapers are simply unavailable. Your window to the world is carefully curated by the state, ensuring that you only see what they want you to see. It's a form of sensory deprivation, preventing you from forming your own conclusions about the outside world. A particularly quirky tidbit from the early Cold War is the intense focus on espionage and counter-espionage. The KGB, which succeeded the NKVD, becomes an even more formidable and ubiquitous presence, and every citizen is implicitly or explicitly encouraged to be on the lookout for spies and saboteurs. Children's books might feature stories of brave young pioneers unmasking foreign agents, and thrilling movies depict daring Soviet intelligence officers outsmarting their Western counterparts. It fostered an atmosphere of suspicion where even an unusual accent or a stray comment could brand someone as an enemy agent. Historians still argue whether the perceived threat of Western infiltration was genuine
or largely exaggerated by the Soviet state to maintain internal control and justify extensive security apparatus. The arms race becomes a dominant theme. You hear reports of successful nuclear tests, of Sputnik orbiting the Earth, all presented as triumphs of Soviet science and engineering over the supposedly backward capitalist world. There's a sense of pride, yes, but also a quiet terror about what these new weapons mean. The threat of nuclear annihilation, though rarely spoken of openly in everyday conversation, hangs like an invisible cloud over the world. You learn about civil defense drills, about what to do in case of an attack, even as you tried to dismiss the very real possibility from your mind. For you, the ordinary citizen, the Cold War meant a constant state of readiness, a perpetual sense of being on the defensive. The world became a binary place, us versus them, socialism versus capitalism, peace versus aggression. And you, whether you liked it or not, were a crucial, albeit small, part of the mighty Soviet bloc, living under the ever-present shadow of a global ideological standoff that dictated the rhythm of your life and the limits of your world. The chill, you realize, is not just in the air, but deep in the bones of the entire system.
The heavy atmosphere of Stalin's final years and the rigid early Cold War begins to subtly shift, like the first tentative signs of spring after a long, brutal winter. You start to feel a slight loosening, a cautious breath of fresh air. This is the period known as the Khrushchev thaw, named after Nikita Khrushchev, who emerged as the new leader after Stalin's death. It doesn't mean sudden freedom, but a definite, palpable change in the air. The most shocking moment, a mainstream historical fact that sends ripples through every level of society, is Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. He publicly denounces Stalin's cult of personality, his purges, and his excesses, albeit to a closed-party audience. While not immediately published, the contents leak, spreading by word of mouth like wildfire. Imagine hearing through whispers and rumors that the very foundation of the previous decades, the infallibility of the great leader, is being publicly questioned by the new one. It's disorienting, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. For you, it means that speaking about the horrors of the purges, previously a death sentence, becomes slightly less dangerous, though still fraught with peril. This period sees a wave of de-Stalinization. Monuments to Stalin are removed, cities named after him are renamed, and books are published that offer a glimpse into the terror of the past, albeit carefully curated ones. Many prisoners from the gulags are released, returning home as gaunt, broken figures, their presence a living testament to the atrocities committed in the preceding decades. It's like a massive collective sigh of relief, mixed with profound sadness for what was lost. Life in the communal apartment might get a little less cramped as new housing initiatives begin. The promise of Khrushchevkas, standardized, prefabricated apartment blocks, starts to materialize, offering individual families their own small, separate living spaces. While often derided for their basic design and thin walls, you can literally hear your neighbor sneeze, they represent a significant improvement in living conditions for millions. Imagine the joy of having your own kitchen, no longer sharing a single stove with 3 other families. It's a small but profoundly impactful change. There's also a renewed focus on consumer goods, a direct response to the long years of austerity. While still far from abundant, you start to see a greater variety of items in shops, from washing machines to simple radios. It's a slow trickle, not a flood, but it signals a shift in priorities, a recognition that the average citizen needs more than just steel and tanks. You might even find yourself dreaming of owning a Volga car, the pinnacle of Soviet automotive luxury, though for most it remains a distant dream. Historians still argue whether Khrushchev's reforms genuinely aimed at liberalizing Soviet society or were a pragmatic attempt to modernize the economy and strengthen the party's legitimacy after Stalin's death. A quirky tidbit from the thaw is the famous kitchen debates
between Khrushchev and then U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon in 1959. They engaged in an impromptu debate in front of an Amican model kitchen at an exhibition in Moscow, arguing about the merits of capitalism versus communism, consumer goods versus heavy industry. For you, it might have been a fascinating glimpse into the perceived material superiority of the West, even if the official media spun it as a Soviet triumph. It's like watching a modern-day influencer debate the merits of their preferred phone brand, but with global superpowers involved. The arts also experience a limited loosening. While censorship remains, there are periods of greater artistic freedom, allowing for more experimental works in film, literature, and theater. You might attend a play that subtly critiques aspects of society, or read a poem that expresses a more personal, less overtly propagandistic sentiment. It's a fragile flowering, often subject to sudden frosts, but for a brief moment, the creative spirit feels a little less stifled. The thaw, though limited, offers a glimpse of what might be possible, a hesitant step away from the frozen rigidity of the past, leaving you with a cautious sense of hope, even as you instinctively continue to watch your words.
The tentative warmth of the Khrushchev thaw gradually gives way to a familiar coolness, a return to a more predictable, if less exciting rhythm. After Khrushchev's ousting, a new leadership emerges under Leonid Brezhnev, ushering in an era often characterized as the stagnation period. For you, it feels less like a dramatic shift and more like settling into a comfortable, albeit slightly dusty armchair. The radical experiments and unpredictable swings of the Khrushchev years are replaced by a focus on stability and collective leadership. The party apparatus grows, becoming more entrenched and bureaucratic. Decision-making becomes slower, more cautious. It's like a large, old machine that's well-oiled but has lost some of its initial drive and dynamism. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Brezhnev era was marked by political stability, but also by declining economic growth rates and a widening technological gap with the West. On the surface, life might seem more comfortable. There's no return to the mass purges, and the intense ideological campaigns of the earlier decades soften. You might even feel a sense of security, a calm predictability in your daily routine. People are generally better fed, better housed, and have more access to consumer goods than their parents did. The collective farms are somewhat more productive, and while shortages persist, they are generally less severe than in earlier times. Imagine a life where you rarely have to worry about political upheaval, but also where true innovation or exciting new opportunities are rare. However, beneath this veneer of stability, problems fester. The economy, heavily centralized and lacking incentives, begins to falter. Productivity growth slows and technological innovation lags behind the West. The command economy, which had excelled at mobilizing resources for heavy industry and wartime production, struggles to meet the diverse and growing demands of a modern consumer society. You might notice that the quality of goods often leaves much to be desired, and choice is limited. It's like being offered a reliable but unchanging menu at a restaurant, where every dish tastes faintly of yesterday. A quirky tidbit from the Brezhnev era is the burgeoning importance of the blat system, or informal networks of connections and favors. With official channels often inefficient or lacking desired goods, knowing someone who knows someone becomes essential. Need to get your car fixed quickly? Want to jump the queue for a better apartment? Blat is your answer. It's a parallel economy of favors and connections that exists beneath the official planned economy, a pervasive system that everyone understands and tacitly participates in. Historians still argue whether the blat system was an inherent flaw of the Soviet planned economy or an adaptive mechanism that allowed people to navigate its inefficiencies. For you, it was simply how things got done, a necessary survival skill in a system that often failed to deliver. The official ideology, too, becomes somewhat stale.
The fervent revolutionary zeal of earlier generations gives way to rote recitation and ritualistic adherence. Propaganda posters are still everywhere, but they evoke less genuine enthusiasm and more a quiet resignation. People go through the motions, attending party meetings, listening to speeches, but often with a detached cynicism. It's like watching a play where everyone knows their lines, but no one truly believes the story anymore. Culturally, this is a period of developed socialism, a term that suggests the Soviet Union has reached a mature, stable stage. Yet dissent, though suppressed, never fully disappears. Small underground networks circulate forbidden literature, samizdat, and whispers of Western music and ideas filter in, often through shortwave radio. You might secretly listen to Voice of America or BBC, catching glimpses of a world beyond the Iron Curtain, a world that seems both alluring and forbidden. For you, the daily rhythm of life settles into a predictable pattern. You work, you receive your modest wage, you queue for goods, you spend time with family and friends. The specter of the purges is gone, but so too is the sense of grand purpose and rapid change. It's a life of quiet endurance, of making do, where personal ambition often gives way to the subtle art of navigating a system that promises much, but delivers just enough to keep you going. The calm, you realize, is less about genuine contentment and more about a pervasive, deep-seated inertia.
While the Brezhnev era brought a degree of stability, it also cemented a defining feature of your daily life in the Soviet Union: the pervasive and often frustrating reality of consumer woes. Forget the dazzling array of choices you see in modern supermarkets. Your shopping experience is a far more strategic and often disappointing endeavor. The planned economy, brilliant at producing tanks and steel, consistently stumbled when it came to meeting the everyday needs and desires of its citizens. This is a mainstream historical fact. Chronic shortages of consumer goods were a hallmark of the Soviet system, from basic foodstuffs to complex appliances. You didn't just walk into a store and buy what you wanted. You had to hunt for it, queue for it, or sometimes just get lucky. It's like living in a perpetual scavenger hunt, where the prize might just be a decent pair of socks. Imagine needing a new pair of shoes. You don't go to a shoe store expecting a selection. Instead, you might hear a rumor that a shipment of shoes has arrived at a particular department store. You drop everything, grab your string bag, the ubiquitous avoska, meaning perhaps bag, because perhaps you'll find something, and rush over, joining a queue that might already stretch around the block. Hours later, you might reach the front, only to find that all the desirable sizes or styles are gone, leaving only oddly shaped pairs and an unfortunate shade of brown. Or even worse, the shipment never materialized. It's a test of patience, endurance, and often sheer luck. Food, while more plentiful than in the famine years, still presents its challenges. Fresh produce, especially outside of harvest season, is often scarce and of low quality. Meat might be available only on certain days or only certain cuts. You become an expert in reading the shelves, discerning what's available, and quickly calculating how to stretch your meager rations. People often had zakupki, large shopping excursions to central cities where the selection might be marginally better, stocking up on non-perishables like sugar, flour, and tea, like preparing for a siege that never quite ends. A particularly quirky tidbit is the phenomenon of the empty shelves paradox. While official reports often boasted of rising production figures, store shelves frequently remained bare. This wasn't always due to absolute lack of production, but often due to inefficiencies in distribution, bureaucratic bottlenecks, or goods being diverted to other channels, like export or the black market. So while the factory across town might be churning out thousands of washing machines, you might never see one in your local appliance store. It's like a magic trick where the goods simply vanish between the factory floor and the consumer. Historians still argue whether the persistent shortages were a direct consequence of central planning's inherent flaws or a result of specific policy choices prioritizing heavy industry over consumer welfare. To cope with these perpetual shortages, you become incredibly resourceful. Repairing rather than replacing is the norm. Everyone knows someone who can fix a leaky faucet, mend a torn coat, or even jury-rig a broken appliance. Bartering for goods or services becomes common, leveraging skills or scarce items you might possess. The black market or tokuchka flea market thrives, offering goods smuggled from the West or items diverted from official channels, albeit at exorbitant prices. Access to these forbidden fruits is often through your aforementioned blat connections. The lack of choice and quality impacts everything, even personal expression. Fashion is largely uniform, determined by the limited range of clothing available. You learn to make do, to adapt, to be grateful for whatever you can get your hands on. While the state proclaims a society of abundance, your daily experience is one of constant negotiation with scarcity, a quiet battle fought in the queues and over the bare shelves of the Soviet shop. It's a relentless background hum of frustration, reminding you that even in a planned economy, life rarely goes according to plan.
Amidst the queues and the daily struggle for consumer goods, there's another, more reassuring side to life in the Soviet Union, the extensive system of social welfare and health care. While far from perfect, the state provided a safety net, guaranteeing certain basic provisions that many in the capitalist world could only dream of. For you, it meant a degree of security, a sense that the state, for all its demands, would at least keep you from falling through the cracks. One of the proudest boasts of the Soviet system, a mainstream historical fact, was its commitment to universal health care. Every citizen, regardless of their status or income, was entitled to free medical care. From routine checkups to complex surgeries, the costs were covered by the state. You might not have the latest Western medical technologies or the luxurious private rooms, but you wouldn't be denied treatment because you couldn't afford it. Imagine a world where a sudden illness or accident doesn't plunge your family into financial ruin. It was a core tenet of the socialist promise. However, free didn't always mean good or convenient. Hospitals could be crowded, equipment might be outdated, and the quality of care could vary widely. You might encounter long waits for specialist appointments, and a common complaint was the lack of basic amenities like toilet paper or proper food in hospitals, sometimes requiring family members to bring in supplies. While the doctor's visit itself was free, access to the best doctors or the latest medications often depended on those informal blat connections we talked about earlier. It's like a grand state-run cafeteria that offers free food, but the best dishes are always reserved for those who know the cook. Beyond healthcare, the state also provided a range of other social benefits. Education was free at all levels, from kindergarten through university. Childcare was heavily subsidized, allowing women to participate in the workforce. Retirement pensions, while modest, offered a degree of financial stability in old age. Housing, though often cramped and in communal apartments, was heavily subsidized, meaning rents were incredibly low. You might pay only a few rubles a month for your apartment, a negligible sum compared to your wages. This security, the knowledge that you wouldn't be homeless or destitute, was a powerful, if quiet, comfort. A particularly quirky tidbit related to healthcare was the widespread use of sanatoriums. These were state-run health resorts, often located in picturesque areas where workers and their families could go for subsidized holidays, ostensibly for rest and recuperation. They weren't just for the sick, they were part of a broader health and leisure policy. You might spend 2 weeks undergoing various treatments, eating prescribed meals, and participating in organized activities, all paid for by your trade union. It was like a mandatory, slightly clinical spa retreat designed to recharge the workforce and remind you of the state's paternalistic care. Historians still argue whether these sanatoriums were genuinely effective health initiatives or primarily served as a form of state-controlled leisure and a tool for social engineering. Employment was also practically guaranteed. The Soviet system proudly declared that there was no unemployment. While this was technically true, everyone had a job, even if it was a nominal one. It often meant widespread underemployment or jobs that offered little actual productivity. You might find yourself in a position where your output wasn't rigorously measured, leading to a sense of complacency or even boredom. It's like having a job where your main task is to look busy regardless of what you actually achieve. So while your life in the Soviet Union came with its share of frustrations and shortages, it also offered a fundamental security that was absent in many other parts of the world. You wouldn't be rich, but you also wouldn't starve or be unable to access basic medical care. This social contract, trading individual freedoms and consumer choice for a guaranteed minimum standard of living, was a cornerstone of the Soviet experience. It was a society that took care of you, in its own rather blunt and often inefficient way, ensuring that you were always provided for, even if that provision sometimes left much to be desired.
Life in the Soviet Union wasn't just about work and cues, it was also about the mind. Your journey through the system begins in childhood, where your mind is carefully cultivated and shaped by a powerful dual-purpose force, education and propaganda. These two concepts were so intertwined that it was often difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. From your very first day of school, you were taught not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also the fundamental tenets of Marxism-Leninism. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Soviet education system was a key tool for ideological indoctrination. History lessons, literature, and even science were all presented through a socialist lens. You'd learn about the glorious October Revolution, the heroism of the Red Army, and the inevitable triumph of communism. The capitalist world, by contrast, was portrayed as a place of exploitation, poverty, and war. It's like being in a school where every subject, from biology to poetry, subtly reinforces the idea that your country is the best and everyone else is either misguided or malicious. Your education is robust, particularly in the fields of science and mathematics, a point of national pride. The state invested heavily in training engineers, scientists, and technicians to build the socialist economy and compete in the Cold War space race. You might be part of a generation of students who excel at physics or chemistry, driven by a national obsession with technological superiority. This emphasis on STEM subjects was a key reason for the Soviet Union's early lead in space exploration, a point of immense national pride and a powerful propaganda tool. But there's also the constant presence of propaganda, not just in school, but everywhere. Posters, films, radio programs, and even public art relentlessly project a message of optimism, hard work, and loyalty to the party. You see images of strong, smiling workers, bountiful harvests, and valiant soldiers. It's a carefully constructed reality, a form of state-sponsored art therapy, where every image is designed to make you feel like you are part of a grand, successful project. You learn to interpret these images and messages, to understand the unspoken subtext, but also to recognize their often hollow ring when they clash with the reality of your daily life. A particularly quirky tidbit is the role of children's organizations like the Young Pioneers. At age 9, you would be invited to join this mass youth organization, distinguished by your red neckerchief. It was a rite of passage, a social and political pressure to conform. You'd participate in parades, patriotic events, and organized activities,
all reinforcing the values of collective action and loyalty to the party. It was like being in a state-run scout troop, but with a heavy dose of ideological training. You would pledge to love your motherland, the Communist Party, and Lenin. Historians still argue whether the pioneer movement was primarily a genuine attempt to build character and civic duty, or a cynical tool for state control and surveillance of children. The universities, the pinnacle of the education system, were also heavily regulated. Admission was not just based on academic merit, but also on a person's social background and political loyalty. Children of workers and peasants were often given priority. You might find yourself being taught by professors who, though brilliant, had to be careful with their words, always mindful of the party line. The social sciences and humanities were especially prone to ideological distortion, as they were the fields most directly concerned with the interpretation of human society and history. For you, the system creates a strange duality. You are taught to be a critical thinker, to excel in logic and science, yet you are also expected to unquestioningly accept a pre-approved set of political truths. You learn to speak one way in public and another way in private. It's a fundamental part of the Soviet experience, the constant negotiation between the official narrative and your own lived reality. The education you receive is a gift, a tool for social mobility and intellectual growth, but it's one that comes with a very specific, non-negotiable instruction manual for how to think and what to believe.
While the state's grip on ideology and education was tight, it couldn't fully stifle the human need for expression and creativity. Thus, a parallel world existed, a vibrant, often constrained, but always present realm of cultural life and censorship. For you, navigating this world was a delicate dance between appreciating sanctioned art and seeking out the forbidden fruits of unofficial expression. On the one hand, there was the official culture. The state, understanding the power of art, heavily subsidized theaters, opera houses, ballet companies, and film studios. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Soviet Union produced world-renowned artists, composers, and performers, and these institutions were a source of national pride. You might attend a breathtaking performance of a Tchaikovsky ballet or a Shostakovich symphony, marveling at the sheer talent on display. But you also knew that the art had to conform to the doctrine of socialist realism, a style that depicted the virtues of socialist society in an idealized, often propagandistic light. It's like watching a movie where every character is a perfect hero, every problem is easily solved, and the ending is always a triumphant celebration of the state. And then there was the other side, the world of unofficial culture. This was the world of samizdat, a term that literally means self-published. This was forbidden literature, poetry, novels, political essays, typed out on old typewriters, often with multiple carbon copies, and passed secretly from hand to hand. The risk was immense. Getting caught with samizdat could land you in prison or a psychiatric hospital. Yet the desire to read the unvarnished truth, to connect with a voice that wasn't filtered through the party line, was a powerful motivator. You might get your hands on a dog-eared, badly typed copy of a Solzhenitsyn novel, its pages a glimpse into a world of terror and hardship that the state desperately wanted to keep hidden. A quirky tidbit from this cultural landscape is the role of bard music. These were guitar-playing singer-songwriters who performed their own songs, often in private gatherings without official permission. Their songs, ranging from deeply personal reflections to subtle political satire, were spread via tape recordings passed from friend to friend. They weren't overtly revolutionary, but their independence and focus on the individual rather than the collective made them a quiet form of dissent. Think of it as the Soviet equivalent of a coffeehouse folk scene, but where every performance carried a faint whiff of danger. These bards, like Vladimir Vysotsky and Bulat Okudjava, became cultural icons.
their voices providing an authentic soundtrack to a life that official culture often failed to capture. Historians still argue whether the state's tolerance of certain bards was a deliberate strategy to allow for a pressure release valve for discontent, or a logistical failure to fully suppress all forms of independent expression. Censorship was a constant presence, a watchful eye over every artist's shoulder. Writers had to submit their work to a pre-publication review, and anything deemed ideologically suspect was either heavily edited or simply rejected. Many talented writers and artists were forced to work for the desk, their creations never seeing the light of day. Musicians had to stick to officially approved repertoire. Even seemingly innocuous things like the choice of a painter's color palette or the filmmaker's use of a certain camera angle could be scrutinized for political meaning. Despite this, artists found ways to push the boundaries, using allegories, symbolism, and clever subtext to convey their true meaning. You might attend a play and find yourself and the rest of the audience collectively understanding a joke or a line of dialogue that had a different meaning to the censors. It was a shared secret, a moment of fleeting freedom in a world of pervasive control. For you, the consumer of culture, this meant living in two worlds: the official, polished, and often hollow world of state-sponsored art, and the secret, rough around the edges, and deeply authentic world of unofficial expression. It's a constant reminder that even in the most controlled societies, the human spirit finds a way to sing its own songs, tell its own stories, and paint its own truths, however softly.
The long, slow rhythm of the Brezhnev era eventually gives way to a new, more dynamic, and ultimately chaotic period. After a brief succession of elderly leaders, a younger, more energetic figure steps onto the stage, Mikhail Gorbachev. He comes with a new set of ideas and a promise to reform the ossified system, but his efforts, intended to save the Soviet Union, ultimately set in motion the forces that would lead to its final collapse. You, having lived through so many cycles of hope and disillusionment, watch this final act with a mixture of cautious optimism and deep-seated apprehension. Gorbachev's two key policies, mainstream historical facts, are glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, or openness, means a relaxation of censorship and a greater freedom of expression. Suddenly, the unspoken truths that you've only ever heard in whispers begin to appear in newspapers and on television. You hear discussions of the purges, of the famines, of the true economic state of the country. It's a shock to the system, like a long-shuttered window being thrown open, letting in a blinding, often uncomfortable light. Imagine a society where, for decades, every public utterance was a lie, and then suddenly, the lies are exposed, one by one. The effect is disorienting, and for many, deeply unsettling. Perestroika, or restructuring, is the economic side of the reform. Gorbachev attempts to introduce market-like elements into the centrally planned economy, giving more autonomy to individual enterprises and allowing for some private ownership. The idea is to inject dynamism and efficiency into the stagnant system. But for you, the initial results are often more chaotic than helpful. The old supply chains break down, and the nascent market mechanisms haven't yet taken their place. Shortages, which had been a chronic problem, become even more severe. You might find yourself queuing for hours for basic items, the availability of which is now even more unpredictable. It's like trying to rebuild a car's engine while it's still driving down the highway. The new atmosphere of openness also allows for the rise of nationalism in the various Soviet republics. What were once suppressed whispers of independence in places like the Baltic states or the Caucasus now become loud, organized movements. You watch on the television as massive demonstrations take place, people waving flags that haven't been seen in decades. This growing centrifugal force, this desire for self-determination, proves to be a powerful and ultimately unstoppable challenge to the unity of the Soviet state. A quirky tidbit from this final period is the explosion of rock music and youth culture. With censorship relaxed, Western rock music, once a forbidden pleasure, becomes widely available. Bands that had once been relegated to underground recordings now fill stadiums. You might see young people with hairstyles and clothes that, just a few years earlier, would have been considered hopelessly subversive. It's a visible, audible expression of a generation's longing for freedom and a connection to the wider world. The soundtrack to the Soviet Union's final years is not a heroic march, but the defiant electric hum of a guitar. Historians still argue whether Gorbachev's reforms were a genuine attempt to democratize the Soviet Union or a desperate, ill-conceived final gamble to salvage a system that was already doomed to fail.
The final descent is swift and dramatic. The failed coup in August 1991, orchestrated by hardline communists, is the last desperate gasp of the old guard. You watch the television, hoping, fearing, and holding your breath as people take to the streets to protest. When the coup collapses, it's clear that the old order is finished. The republics declare their independence in rapid succession, and on December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigns, declaring his post to be extinct. The Soviet flag, which had flown over the Kremlin for 74 years, is lowered for the last time. And just like that, it's over. The vast, sprawling empire that defined your entire life simply ceases to exist. The world you knew, with its rules, its certainties, its cues, and its fears, is gone. You stand on the threshold of a new, uncertain future. A future where freedom is now a possibility, but so is instability and hardship. The grand experiment, which promised a utopia but delivered a life of quiet endurance, has finally ended, leaving behind a profound and bewildering silence. Now, take a deep breath. The journey through time is complete. The sounds of cues, the whispers of fear, the clang of factories, they all fade into the distance. You're no longer shivering in a communal apartment or waiting in line for a loaf of bread. You're here, in your own comfortable space, listening to the soft hum of the fan, safe and sound. The weight of that history, all the struggle and sacrifice, the hope and the heartbreak, can now be gently set aside. The past has receded, and all that's left is the stillness of the night. So take a moment to let yourself sink into your pillow, feel the warmth of your blanket, and allow the quiet to settle in. There's nothing more to do, nothing more to think about. Just rest now. It's time to sleep. Sweet dreams.